mentioned, we are a bunch of grad students from the Sheardown lab at McMaster University, and so we've essentially come here today to give you kind of a brief overview of not only kind of our paths to university and our education so far, but also to show you kind of what we've been doing in research lately, as well as kind of talk about engineering and university and give you some time for a little bit of a Q&A at the end. As I mentioned, I'm Taylor, and so I'm originally from Ridhdhi, and that's where I went to high school. And like you guys are, I was sitting in chemistry class one day, and I kind of realized, essentially, chemistry for me at least at the time was one of my passions. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do from a university and educational standpoint. I was kind of conflicted between engineering and between science, so I kind of applied to a bunch of universities for both science and engineering, and ended up deciding to go to McMaster because essentially they have a few universities have this, but McMaster as well has this general first year, which is awesome because it allows you to experience a whole bunch of different programs through courses like programming, where you get to actually kind of do some programming in Python, which is one of the learning languages, and then you also get to do things like material science and courses that you wouldn't really get to do if you were to go straight into a specific program. And so the great thing about that is it gave me an opportunity to see everything, but I still kind of loved chemistry, and so I decided to go specifically into chemical engineering. But the great thing about Mac is, as we'll discuss later, there's a lot of options for programs, and so I actually chose to go into chemical and bioengineering. And so this program is actually, instead of a typical 4-year program, what we love to say in engineering is that engineering is the best 4 to 7 years of your life because it takes so long sometimes. Some people choose 5-year programs, some people choose to go on co-op once or twice or even more. And so I ended up going to chemical and bioengineering. This program essentially is a 5-year program that tacks on an extra year of content in what's called bioscience. So essentially you get to take really cool courses like anatomy and physiology, where you get to actually work with human cadavers, which is like pretty unique to the Mac environment. But as well as that, you also get to work with courses like immunology and biology and biochemistry. And funny enough, I actually never took high school biology or like anything in first year, so I actually had no experience in biology. But I was just interested overall in so as I mentioned, like I was going through this 5-year program, and really interesting. You can kind of take courses in anatomy and physiology, immunology, a whole bunch of cool courses, and I'd never taken biology, so that's one cool thing, is that you don't actually have to have done certain courses. I mean, you need the prerequisites to get into university, but after that, it's kind of free reign as long as you've got the general first year under your belt. And so that was great, and I loved the program. And after my 4th year, because it's a 5-year program, I decided I needed a break. So I went on co-op, and we'll talk a lot more about co-op, Ridhdhi and I, and we'll talk about kind of the different options there are for that near the end. But after doing co-op, which was a full year off for me, where I got time to kind of take a break, make a little bit of money to pay for a lot of the student debt you kind of incur over the time, it was nice to come back and do my final year. So in this final year, I was able to do my undergraduate thesis, which is usually a kind of a science thing that you do. But our program is awesome because it allows you to kind of get an idea of what research is like. And so we both, I think Ridhdhi did this as well. I can't remember. I think she did, yeah. So, but we both did the undergraduate thesis, and then this kind of gave me a passion for research overall. And then that's kind of what landed me in my master's, and that's where I am today. So I finished my master's in hopefully a few months, and then I'll be looking for jobs. I'm also doing my master's at McMaster with the Sheardown lab in the same chemical engineering department. But after I finish this, I'm kind of looking towards jobs in a whole bunch of different areas. And the cool thing about chemical engineering specifically is that it's a very broad and versatile degree. We take a lot of the fundamentals of a whole bunch of different engineering fields and put it into one. And so, I'm really passionate about both space and medicine, not together necessarily, but both. So I'm, as a chemical engineer, you can apply to companies like SpaceX and NASA and the Canadian Space Agency, or you can go and apply to something like Pfizer or Moderna, or it's one of these, pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of variation in what you can do as a chemical engineer, and so shameless plug because we're all in chemical engineering, but that's kind of the idea there. But apart from that, really interested in just as a human overall, just love hockey, love play guitar, and big into traveling. So I'll pass it on to, I believe, Mitch.
Well, I'm Mitch. I'm a PhD student in the same lab as Taylor and Ridhdhi. So just a little bit of background of me. I'm from Sudbury, and I have kind of a similar way of getting into it as Goose does. So I went to Western for my undergraduate, but unlike Goose, I didn't think I was particularly good at chemistry. So I never kind of thought I'd end up the way I ended up. I thought I was pretty good at math, and that's why I chose engineering originally, but a couple of years of calculus kind of showed me I wasn't particularly good at math, and that was kind of a good time to start thinking about something else. We have a general first year there as well, so it's a really good way to kind of dip your toes into the different things and decide what you like. And Western, similar to Mac, has a chemical and biochemical engineering program, which I thought was really great. I did my undergraduate in that. And I got involved in research pretty young, so right at your age right now, between the summer of high school going into university, was when I first became a summer student at a lab at a university. And I did that every summer, essentially up until I graduated, doing all these kind of different projects, things like biofuels from algae, and then specifically like very bio-heavy things where we were screening for new compounds to use for paint. And then going further, kind of did an international one during my undergraduate where I went to Germany to do research as well. So all those things, if you ever think research might be something you're interested in doing, you have a lot of opportunities kind of dip your toes in and see what you like, what you don't like. So for me, I kind of learned that I was big into biomaterials, and I really liked the work that I've been involved in with different places there. So that's kind of how I chose to end up going to grad school, and I originally started out in my master's, and I was there for, 2 years essentially before I decided to transfer into my PhD. So I've been in the PhD about a year now. So we're looking down the barrel of maybe 2 more years of that. And then one of the big kind of processes or industries that chemical engineering, specifically biochemical engineering, is all about is brewing. So I had a few friends who went and did co-ops at places like Labatt as part of our program. So that remains kind of a side hobby of mine. And then I'm also big into watching the Lions lose every few weeks. So that's just a little bit about me.
Hey guys, I'm Ridhdhi. I'm originally from Brampton, Ontario, and I guess kind of the same thing as Taylor and Mitch. Very confused when I was in high school, not sure what to do. I originally actually wanted to do architecture, but similar to Haley, I did one of those high school co-op things, and I realized, hey, this is not for me. They work ridiculous hours, so I was like, not for me. But then because Mac has that first year general engineering program, I decided to give that a shot. I wasn't sure that I really specifically wanted to go into chemical engineering, but I think I kind of made that decision after doing that first year general and seeing what the different types of engineering programs that were offered, and then kind of went from there. I did the undergrad in chemical and bioengineering, and similar to what Taylor said, I never took any biology courses in high school. I think for us it was an option to take biology in grade 11 and 12, and I chose not to do it because I just wasn't a fan of it back in the day. But it seemed like a cool program that Mac had to offer, and one of the things that is key to know is that you don't do a lot of straight up chemistry in chemical or bioengineering or biology, which is kind of nice. So you do need the prereqs, but it's not like that's all you're going to be doing. So that was one of the things that kind of attracted me to the program. And then my thought process while I was doing my undergrad was always to go into industry, but I did 2 co-ops in 2 separate process engineering roles, and I realized this is not for me. I never did any of those summer research positions like Mitch mentioned, but as Taylor mentioned before, I did a final year thesis, and that was where I was like, okay, I like doing the research. I did in a bioengineering / chemistry heavy lab, and that's where I kind of figured out like, hey, this is what I like, this is what I like to do. So I decided to go into the master's program at McMaster in Chemical Engineering. Aside from that, I mean, I do love chemical engineering and what I do, but I like to backpack, hike, and trek, and doing all the co-ops and stuff in university was a great way to make some money so I could do those things.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of background about kind of the lab before we start talking a bit more individually about what we do. So essentially what our lab is we're all about biomaterials. So our lab, we're kind of specifically focused in which we look at really engineering kind of developments that help with specifically the eye, but really what we're all about is biomaterials. So biomaterials, any kind of material that's designed to interact with the body. So that's anything from a prosthesis to kind of specifically what we do, which is polymers that aid in drug delivery. And so I know 3 engineers kind of came to talk to you today. It's really actually a very multidisciplinary field. So people who work right alongside us might be engineers or specifically chemists or specifically biologists. There's quite a lot of different knowledge spheres go into making and developing biomaterials. And then for us specifically, kind of a big thing is commercialization. So we have a small startup company based on some of our work, and that's sort of part of the outreach program that we're doing today. But really one of our big focuses is how can we kind of move some of our research into actual clinical use. So just to give a little bit of an example of what it looks like and what our thought process behind our ideas look like, is you can take a disease that affects the eye like glaucoma. So glaucoma is the 3rd leading cause of blindness, and it typically affects older people. So the way glaucoma is treated is through eye drops. And all 3 of us work on eye drops because actually eye drops are historically very ineffective. So if you're in your 60s and you're diagnosed with glaucoma, a lot of people need to take a daily eye drop pretty much for the rest of their life. So that means for the next 20 to 30 years, in order to not lose your vision, you might be expected to take a daily eye drop in order to treat the disease. So when we look at things like that, what we really want to see is how can we improve upon these existing medical treatments to something that really helps the patient. So instead of taking an eye drop every single day, can you take it once a month? Can you take it once every couple of months? The goals for things like this is like once a year. And then finally, we want to develop these materials, but we also need them to be practical. We need them to be comfortable. We need it to be easy for the person to either give themselves or for a doctor to give them. So we want to look at how can we develop a material, but also can we really make this material feasible? So would it be an easy transition to then take it from our research on the bench to take it right beside someone's bedside? Or does a lot of work need to be going into developing and really optimizing how we could make this for people to actually use? So we just have these kind of like big 3 criteria whenever we're designing some of our ideas on how we can approach problems.
Yeah, so as Mitch mentioned, we work in the biomaterial space, so we're going to kind of give an overview of some of the research we specifically do in the lab for our master's and PhD projects, respectively. So a lot of you may or may not have taken an eye drop, and I'm sure you've seen people take them before at least, and every time somebody takes an eye drop, you almost immediately notice that half of it falls down your face, a bunch of it ends up in your nose, down the back of your throat. Essentially, as soon as you take it, you start blinking because you get a reflex blink. So as Mitch mentioned, eye drops are one of the most ineffective ways to get drugs to the eye, but they're also the least invasive because other options include needles under certain portions of your eye to get the drug there, or people are looking into contact lenses, but those are very tough to get the right actual properties for once you start modifying them. As well as what Mitch does actually is in situ gels, which he'll talk about his stuff in a bit, but essentially most of the work that goes on is to do with topical delivery through eye drops. So as he mentioned, we're kind of trying to optimize and improve those kinds of formulations. So for the most part, eye drops are just the drug that you're trying to use to treat whatever condition, essentially suspended in a solution of essentially saline, so a salt water type solution, so that it's nice and feels comfortable when it hits your eye. But that is really all they are to this point. There's some new advancements in that, but what we're really trying to do is improve the delivery of those drugs, because when you do that drop and it goes all over your nose and your eye and stuff, you lose about 95% of that drug in the first application. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve the amount of that drug that actually gets to the eye in order to actually treat the condition you're looking at treating. So to give an idea, we're specifically, my project is using what are called adhesive nanoparticles. And so these are essentially going to be able to deliver drug to the eye over a longer period of time by sticking to the surface of your eye. So you actually have a mucus layer on your eye, the same as you have a mucus layer in your nose. It's actually a very small, thin layer of mucus on your eye, and we can actually leverage the fact that that's there in order to stick particles onto it that can stay there and deliver drug over time. So what's a nanoparticle? I mean, let's get into the nanoscale of things to give an idea of it, but essentially a pinhead is a millimeter in diameter. If you look at smaller than that, you're looking at human hair. So like looking at like human hair is about the smallest you're able to pretty much see. And when you start getting lower than that, you need things like a microscope to be able to actually see something like a cell. And then there's things that are way, way smaller than that, things that actually go into cells. So like viruses and DNA and different small molecules. And those things are where we are at the nanoscale finally. So as you can see, like the influenza virus is about 130 nanometers in size, but the particles that I'm specifically designing are like 5 times smaller than that. So they're actually extremely small. They're about 30 to 40 nanometers in size. And so these particles you cannot see unless you use what is called like an electron microscope, and it's a very high intensity microscope that allows you to image things that are at this extremely small scale. And so the chemistry that we actually do in the lab, essentially for the most part, we're doing chemistry. We're not actually doing a whole lot of chemical engineering when it comes down to it. So like at the start of my degree, I've essentially in my master's started from scratch doing a whole lot of actual chemical synthesis. So as we kind of mentioned before, like chemical engineering we take some courses in chemistry and in biology, but when it comes down to it, chemical engineering is a lot of physics and applied physics. And so when we actually do the research, a lot of it actually ends up being more so on the chemistry side. So what I've been doing is synthesizing from scratch these small molecules called monomers, and then essentially taking these small molecules and putting them together in a chain to make polymers. And so you've probably heard of polymers as plastics, but polymers are used in pretty much every, not every industry, but a whole lot of industries, and they're especially useful in the biomaterials space. And so these polymers that I'm making, the monomer is essentially an adhesive type of molecule. And so when I take a whole bunch of these polymers and put them together, they make what are called those nanoparticles at a really, really small scale, like a virus. And then apart from that, we do a whole lot of testing, which is not as exciting. And then the benefit, though, of using these really small, like adhesive nanoparticles is essentially that little adhesive part to them. The adhesive chemistry makes them stick to the surface of the eye. So when you put the eye drop on, those particles migrate right to the surface of the eye, and then they actually stick to the mucus. And the ability to stick to the surface of the eye allows them to essentially stay there for a longer period of time. And you can trap drug inside of those really small particles. And then while that particle is sitting on the surface of the eye, the drug will slowly diffuse out of the particle and into the tissues at the front of the eye, instead of that whole thing being washed away really quickly. So the great thing about the small size of these particles is that they don't actually inhibit any of the optical properties of a solution. So when you put them in a solution, you wouldn't even know that they were there. It essentially looks like water. Like you're doing the same eye drop. It just has these particles that are so small you can't even see them. And the great thing about them is that the small size allows them to actually access these deeper tissues in your eye that larger particles wouldn't be able to. And like I mentioned, obviously this isn't beneficial at all if you can't actually deliver drugs. So they're able to trap drug inside of them. And then when they sit on the surface of your eye, they slowly release drug over time, so that hopefully you improve that 95% loss of drug to 90 or 80% loss of drug. So it's just in terms of benefiting how much drug actually gets to the eye. So that's a little bit of an overview of what I've been doing, and we'll go on to Mitch, and he can discuss his research.
Okay, so where Goose works kind of small, I tend to work large. So I don't do things that are nanoparticles. I do kind of what are called macropolymers. So those are kind of like big polymer chains that are going to work together in unison to create kind of one object. And like Goose said, what I work in is, they're called in situ gels, and they can also be called responsive gels. But what these really are is they're a type of polymer that are going to be in one state at one condition, and when you change that condition, the whole sample is going to change. So they can react to a whole bunch of different things. The most commonly used, and the one I use as well, is thermal changes, but there can also be things like light, ionic strength, shear is a big one, so kind of the actual movement of the gel itself is going to change its structure. So the reason these gels work is actually more rooted in physics than it is in chemistry, but the way to get them work is all about the chemistry. So how can you combine different monomers to get the right polymer that has kind of like the right gelling abilities that we're looking for? So here's just like a really quick short video of how that works. So this is just a vial of what would look like an eye drop, right? A nice liquid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in a water bath. So the water bath's at 37 degrees, just like your body is. So it's higher in temperature than it is at room temperature. And what happens is that polymer goes from a nice liquid solution to it forms this rigid white gel. So once it's heated up, it makes this nice, really rigid white gel. And that's really good for us. Because like Goose was talking about, when you have something like an eye drop and you just have drug suspended in what's essentially salt water, it's really easy for the drug to travel. When you then put a drug and you put it in something that's a little bit more solid, it takes a lot more time for the drug to move out of that solid than it does a liquid. So what that gives you is it gives you a bit of a thing that we call sustained release. So instead of it all just coming out and immediately moving somewhere, what we can do is control how quickly that drug is going to move out of our solid and move into the place that we want it to be. And the other big thing that I work on is what's called controlled degradation. So the thing about a gel like this is, unlike Goose's, you can kind of see that it does impede vision. So what we do is we apply it to what's called the inferior fornix, which is the pocket just below your lower eyelid in the globe of your eye. So that way you can drop it right there. And a couple other ointments on the market are kind of based on this idea. You can apply it there and it doesn't impede vision. And it releases the drug that you're trying to release. But the other thing is you don't really want to have that there forever, right? And that's true of a lot of polymers, is once you get it somewhere, you also want it to have the ability to leave. So a big thing that I focus on and that the lab focuses on well is controlled degradation. So how can we harness the natural mechanisms of the eye in order to get rid of our things once they've done their job? The good news is that the eye is really effective at getting rid of things. This is, everything from dust particles to any kind of debris that gets into your eye. Your eye is really good at removing things. So we can kind of take advantage of a lot of things to then design our polymers that break down because of enzymes, because of water present, because of kind of different factors, even like movement can help us break down our polymers once they've delivered their drug so that we can remove them naturally and easily afterwards. So like Taylor was saying, like our day-to-day is really about chemistry. So kind of like going into the lab and trying something new, and all that's rooted in chemistry. So even though the three of us don't really have like the truest chemical backgrounds, it's more or less what we do on our day-to-day. So the engineering's a lot involved in kind of optimization and things like that, but just the day-to-day work is really all about applied chemistry. And we'll use all different kinds of polymers and all different kinds of chemistries. So for some of our work, we might use polymers that come from trees, polymers that come from shrimp, and we'll combine that with synthetic polymers that can give us maybe those thermoresponsive abilities, some of those adhesion abilities. And then we kind of work all those together to try and get the solutions that work best.
So my research is actually very similar to what Taylor does in terms of using small nanoparticles. So I'm not going to go through a lot of that because he went pretty in depth in that. But what I'm basically doing is also making long-lasting eye drops to treat front of the eye diseases. So I'm mainly focused on treating allergy symptoms for front of the eye. But like I said, like Taylor has mentioned, like Mitch has mentioned, we can really put any drug in it and kind of make it for the treatment of any front of the eye disease, but that's the one that I'm specifically focused on. And honestly, the goal of what we're kind of doing, and I think Taylor mentioned that before, is to just make a more comfortable eye drop that can have more drug in it, and so we can deliver more therapeutics to the eye and therefore get better outcomes for patients, and then also just essentially dose less frequently. There's a little video, but I don't know why it's asking you to request access, but that's fine, Mitch. It's fine. It was honestly just a cute little video of my particles floating around. It's okay. So a lot of what I do is also focused on synthesizing these particles, doing different chemistry. All of us do kind of sort of a different type of chemistry. Whereas Taylor is making adhesive particles, I'm making particles that are able to actually travel through that tear film that we have naturally in our eye and kind of go deep into our actual, onto our cell surface, on our tissue surface of the eye, and then release the drug there so that you have more drug being directly delivered to your cells, which is kind of where you see the benefits of the drug in that area. So a lot of what we do is kind of do the synthesis, the chemistry behind it. A lot of it's which involves testing the polymer and the micelles, which are kind of the nanoparticle properties. Also measuring how much drug we can get into them, because the more drug we can get in, the less we have to dose them, and the faster and the better outcomes for the patients, as well as kind of how well they do in vitro, which would be in the lab setting, so outside of the body, in tests that we create to kind of simulate how our body responds to these materials, and then also in vivo, which would be testing it in animals or even just on tissues, tissue cultures that we grow in the lab. So mine are a little bit different. They're kind of dependent on the size and the properties of the particles. So the protein is kind of what is covering your eye. So your eye has a tear film, which has a bunch of proteins in it, and that's where it's typically hard to get these nanoparticles to go through, because it acts as a protective layer to keep out dust, particles, and other things from getting into your cells. And so what I'm really focused on is trying to get these particles deep within and pass through this protein layer so that they can go deep to the actual tissue to deliver drugs. And so I'm really focused on seeing how well they kind of move through this protein tier gel. And that I do through tracking them as single particle tracking, and that I can actually see how well they travel. That's what the video was, but we can't see it, but that's okay. So it's really, like they all kind of mentioned before, although our undergrad has a lot of process engineering, applied chemistry, what we kind of do in grad school is more synthetic chemistry and actually using a lot of what you learn in organic chemistry or in just straight up other chemistry courses, and applying it to actually synthesize these materials. So, I mean, you're really only going to be doing straight up, or you will still be doing chemistry in undergrad, but a lot of this synthetic chemistry really comes in grad school and not in your undergrad. So if this is the path that you choose to take, you'll get to be kind of working with these cool biomaterials and stuff. So I'll go a little bit into the McMaster Engineering program just in general. So as we mentioned before, McMaster Engineering has a first-year general program. So when you apply from straight out of high school, you apply just to Engineering 1, which is a general program which all of the incoming students from high school take. They take the same, I think it's about 12 courses. And that kind of really gives you a good feel of what the different programs entail. So you take courses specifically in chemistry, physics, math, but you also take a few programming courses, a few AutoCAD-based design courses as well. So you kind of get a good feel of what maybe mechanical engineers do, civil engineers do, and then with the chemistry side of things, you get an idea of what chemical engineers do as well. So it gives you a good feel, and then based on that, you apply to your second year program, which is where you can sort of specialize in the different programs that are available, such as chemical engineering and bioengineering, so chemical and bioengineering is another subset of chemical engineering. There's civil engineering, there's computer science and engineering, electrical engineering, physics, material science and engineering, mechanical engineering. And then MAC also offers these specialized programs. All of the ones that I mentioned before except for chemical and bioengineering, are 4-year programs. And then you can take another added minor. It's sort of a minor, but it's a double degree option, which includes chemical or any kind of engineering, and then a management option or a society option, and that kind of adds on an extra year. So instead of being a 4-year program, it's a 5-year program, and with engineering and management. Essentially what you're taking are a bunch of business courses to sort of be able to work in sort of like an engineering and professional management sort of setting in the future. With engineering and society, it's more so focused on looking at how engineering can benefit society, looking at like the different impacts of engineering on a global scale as well, which is sort of like a cool option that you can do as well. And then we also have a new iBiomed program, which you have to apply for directly from high school, so directly from grade 12. And it's a 5-year program in which it's more so focused on doing any sort of engineering that's available on the list, and then doing like a bioengineering option or a biomedical engineering option alongside of it. And that's just to kind of see how well these like other engineering programs fit into like biomedical sciences. And then typically all of our class sizes in first year are about 100 to 500 students, because that's like, it depends on how many it depends on how big the courses are, and like some of them are elective courses and don't have that many students, whereas other ones, like everyone is taking this in first year, so they are usually very large. And then our upper year courses, where things are a little bit like people have picked, so second year and above, they kind of become smaller to 20 to 150 students. And that, once again, is dependent on, you get more freedom to pick what kind of courses you want to take. So if you're more so interested in process engineering, in the chemical engineering stream, then you can take specific process engineering courses and you can minor in that field. So that might have a smaller class size because not everyone wants to do that. There's 3 different options. There's a wet stream option, which is more so focused on wastewater treatment and that sort of thing. So once again, that might have smaller class sizes, mainly because that's what people are more so interested in. So you have more flexibility with what you get to choose, whereas in first year engineering, it's more, all the courses are mostly mandatory and you have to take them. But aside from that, the class sizes are typically those sizes. We have, most of the larger classes have access to a lot of TAs, and the profs are great as well, so you have the flexibility to ask questions. And it's not like there's 100 people and like you don't have any face-to-face time with any of the profs, so it's pretty good in that way too. And then in terms of just extracurriculars and clubs and teams that you can get involved in, the university has over 300 clubs and teams, and some of the examples listed here are Solar Car, which is focused on trying to build a solar-powered car. There's Baja Racing. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but I think Taylor might know that one. And then there's also departmental clubs, such as like chemical engineering has their own club. That's basically for the department. They host events like fun group gatherings, activities. They also do sort of a little a formal at the end of things and stuff like that. So it's pretty nice. There's a lot of ways you can get involved at the university and kind of build a good network of friends through other programs and stuff based on the clubs that are more so open to anyone. And then for Engineering 1, all of the students take, as we mentioned before, they all take a common first year, and then you kind of discover what you like. And like I mentioned before, you kind of get to dip your toes into all the different types of engineering that are offered at McMaster, so that kind of gives you an idea of what you like and what you don't like, and then based on that, you can apply to what you want to do in your second year.
Yeah, so just to reiterate what Ridhdhi was saying about the class sizes, there was in one class, the both of us took anatomy and physiology in the second year. So that course, the course is essentially a mixture of students from, so all the first year nursing students, all of the first year, I think, midwifery students, as well as all the second year chemical engineering, and then I think at this point probably all the people who are in that iBiomed program, as well as all the health science students. I think the entire course has like literally over 1,000 students in it. So that's one of the examples of like a ridiculously large class size, where I think, so the course is usually hosted in the one building that has, I think, the largest capacity room, which I think it seats, so I looked online, it seats like 615 people or so. And then another example is that I had in final year a course where it was a very specialized course, like one of our elective courses in chemical engineering, where it had, I think, like 12 to 15 people enrolled. So if you get a really, like, you end up with essentially anything from a massive course like that all the way down to something that's essentially like what you're in now, like a high school class size. So it gets really like more specific as you go along, which is nice. But to get into like the co-op, we were mentioning before that, so Ridhdhi and I both did co-ops in our second to last year. And what was awesome about that is that there's the co-op program at Mac. I know there's a lot of co-op programs all throughout different universities. Can't really speak too much to the other ones, but specifically at Mac at least, there's flexible work terms from like 4, 8, 12, and 16-month terms. So people do 4-month terms during summer sometimes, so that they can essentially have a nice job and get some good industry experience during that short period of time that you're off, from essentially May through to September. But like as Ridhdhi and I did, I think Ridhdhi did a 16-month, right?
Yeah, I did. But I also did a 4-month one in another summer.
Yeah, so you have so many options. And so specifically what I was doing is I was at Ontario Power Generation, which is the nuclear plants in Pickering and Darlington, next to Oshawa. And so when I was there, it was really awesome because I had a 12-month term. I actually went and got a place with some other students who were on co-op as well in Pickering. And essentially, you have a nice 12 months to, I'm not going to say relax because you're still working, but it's a complete departure from school. So you get a nice 12 months to experience to an extent, depending on your job, what this field is that you're going into. And so it was really interesting. I got to experience a lot of what goes on in industry, and really cool because working at a nuclear plant was interesting because I got to actually like do a lot of tours of the actual plant and take people in. Highest security place that you'll probably ever go to. It has like more security than probably like Area 51. I don't know. It was crazy. In terms of travel, like a lot of people get opportunities to go to a whole bunch of other countries around the world. So one of our friends went to Switzerland to work at a drone company. And one of our friends, she was in the same program as us, and she worked at Tesla. And like the cool thing about some of these opportunities, right, is that going on those co-ops gets your network, like builds your network, so the people you actually know. And so for the one who's working in Switzerland on his co-op, he ended up going back there, and he's working there now full time. And then for the friend of ours who worked for Tesla, she ended up going back there after university, but actually going back to California and working at Google and Apple. And so like it just broadens your network so much, which is a really awesome opportunity because once you get out of university, you're kind of on your own. But while you're in university, you have the co-op program, you have the personnel there to help you get in touch with these companies. So you get to gain experience, as we mentioned, with not only networking, but with what your actual industry will be like, and also you get to make some money while you're doing it, which is awesome. So the average is actually about $47,000 for a 12-month term, and about $10,000 for a 4-month term. And really, if you wanted to explain your co-op, because you did 2 different work terms, which is awesome.
Yeah. So my 4-month one was at a pharma company, but it was more so based on process engineering. So a lot of what I did was developed standard of operation protocols for a new product line they were working on developing, which was pretty cool. Like Taylor mentioned before, it's a great way to network with the people that work in the company. Obviously, with 4 months, it's a little bit trickier because the first month and a bit is just you getting trained and used to the work environment, and then the rest of it is like you actually getting to do the work. But like I mentioned before, you kind of get to learn a lot, and it's you get to learn a lot, and it's a great opportunity, and yeah, making money is always nice. And then for the 16-month co-op, I did that at Suncor Energy. It's they work in the oil and gas sector, so they basically own all Petro-Canada, which is where you pump up your fuel for your car. And in that one, I was in environmental health and safety. So a lot of what I did there was working with them to lower sort of like the emissions and stuff that they put out into the environment. But it was a great opportunity. You learn a lot. I actually got to get away from, I guess, GTA and work in Sarnia, which was a whole other experience. But it was a good experience. But like I mentioned before, like Taylor mentioned before, a lot of these co-ops you get to move away, do different things. And the neat thing is, like, you really get to apply a lot of what you learn in class in an actual work setting, so you see the value of what you're learning. And also you learn a lot of things that you wouldn't learn in a class setting as well, like a lot of softwares and programs that you use. We don't get exposure to all of them through the courses that we take, but when you work in that industry, when you work in that company, and you learn about these like different softwares and options that they have, it really gives you the hands-on experience that you wouldn't get from your courses. And I guess like a lot of people will say this now, but co-ops, doing co-ops, especially in STEM or engineering, is becoming increasingly more important. A lot of employers sort of look for that after you graduate as well. So it's always a great way to build your resume, build your network, and kind of grow and learn things that you wouldn't learn in a classroom setting.
Yeah, and one of the cool things is, even though it sounds weird, it's actually a good way to learn what you don't want to do. Because if you end up having a co-op and you're like, well, I don't like this field, I don't like this company, I don't like this job necessarily, like maybe I'm just not as interested in engineering as I thought I was or something when you go into the field. Like, it gives you also an option to be like, okay, I've spent a year, I'm not done university yet, so I'm not stuck in a career path yet. Like, I have another year to graduate and then figure out what I want to do. And so that kind of allows you to like reset and try something new potentially. And it's also like not a huge demand, like, or sorry, not a huge like contract or something. Like you're at max there for 16 months, and once you're done that, like you're done. You don't have to go back, right? You haven't signed a full-time contract with a company where you're like, okay, well now if I quit, I'm gonna look bad. But so it's nice to figure that out too at the same time.
And just one quick thing to add, that bit based on what Taylor was saying, a lot of people that I know actually got offered full-time jobs from the co-op companies that they worked at, especially the ones that they did in their last final years. So it's a great way to kind of secure a job at the end of it too, if you want.
Yeah, and so just to wrap up, our lab is located in the main engineering building on campus. This is like one of the oldest buildings on campus. It's been revamped quite a bit. And it's home to most of the general engineering, most of the traditional engineering programs like chemical, mechanical, civil. Some of the other ones such as like software and computer science and mechatronics, so like robot type engineering. That stuff's all in a separate building. But if you do end up going to McMaster, this is one of the buildings that you'll spend most of your time in. But yeah, apart from that, thanks for listening to us. We really appreciate you guys having us here. And if you guys have any questions, thanks again, Haley. That was awesome helping put together this presentation. And thank you all for listening. Do you have any questions? We're free to answer literally whatever you guys have. So I actually had no idea what I wanted to go into, and specifically coming out, I didn't have any really specific interest in nuclear. I didn't look at it as something that I was specifically set on. I just kind of wanted to go into a general first year to see what I wanted to do. But yeah, nuclear was just something I kind of happened to end up in for my co-op. So I applied to companies that were in the pharma sector, in the oil and gas, in the energy sector. And the problem with not the problem, but one of the things with co-op is you're just like if you're trying to find a job, right? You don't just apply to one place, you apply to a whole bunch. And Ontario Power Generation was one of the companies that just answered my call first, so I ended up just joining them first. But they were a really cool experience. And yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a nuclear engineering program, but the one at it's branded as Ontario Tech right now, right? But it used to be called UOIT.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm from Whitby, so that was the university in our area growing up. But you don't have to go into nuclear engineering by any means to go work at a company like that. My supervisor was a chemical engineer as well. A lot of people come from a whole bunch of different backgrounds. So the cool thing about most engineering, but specifically I would say the traditional engineering programs, is a lot of them teach the very similar basic fundamental principles that you need to kind of succeed as an engineer in a bunch of different fields. So as a nuclear engineer, you'll learn a whole bunch of things that chemical engineers and mechanical engineers and civil engineers will all learn as well. The exception to that is probably things like software and computer science that are a little more specific to their field. But Yeah, so to answer your question specifically, I didn't choose to go into nuclear. I was just kind of the one that I got the co-op for.
I would say no. Honestly, it's a great way to get experience, and you get paid. So a lot of what I got paid, I put towards paying off like OSAP loans and stuff to actually make sure that I was able to graduate a little bit debt-free to some degree. But in terms of like I mentioned before, once you graduate, a lot of employers like to see that you have some sort of hands-on experience, and you do get that experience from doing co-ops. The only downside, I think, would be maybe adding an extra year to your degree, but like I mentioned before, they pay decently well, and it's an experience that you can put on your resume. So it's a great way to kind of also build your network, and you can use that to sort of get a job afterwards as well. So there's no major disadvantages to doing a co-op besides the extra year that it might take.
Yeah, so the PhD is, I think I'm kind of rare in terms of research fields, is that I actually always want to go into research, like even in undergrad. I always saw that as kind of like my end goal. And I'd always wanted to do a PhD, so what I was kind of using was my master's to see where I wanted to do my PhD. And I just liked what I was doing a lot. And when you switch from your master's to PhD, you can keep using the same stuff you've been using. Mm-hmm. So you get a lot of benefit, mainly in cutting off time, but so long as you're happy with where you are, it's a really good thing to do if you want to kind of pursue the PhD route. And then I'm actually giving a presentation tomorrow to university students about where to go for grad school and why I did that switch. So in a bit of a weird way, because people ask me this all the time, like how different are Western and McMaster? Functionally, almost they're the exact same. So being like a TA at McMaster and teaching courses, helping to teach courses, and then taking all those courses at Western, fundamentally, they're not very different at all. You'll learn pretty much the exact same things from almost the exact same textbooks at the same time. So for certain things, they're actually not very different at all. When I made that transition to grad school, what I was looking at is more what I wanted to work on than where I wanted to do it. So I really wanted to do these kind of like responsive materials, and the best we thought was that. Western doesn't really need that quite style of medical engineering.
I stayed in res. I was in an apartment style res because as much as I liked having, I liked the idea of having a roommate, I knew I would never be able to sleep if I had someone there beside me. So the one cool thing about the res options at the university were some of them were like you do have housemates, but it's an apartment style res, so you kind of have your own bedroom, and then you have like a shared kitchen space and a living room space. So that's the kind of res that I stayed in, and I genuinely thought it was a great way to make friends and like meet people. A lot of my best friends that I made out of undergrad were my roommates, and we lived together like for the next 5 years together until like we were all in university. So. And aside from that, I met a lot of people in just like first year engineering. It was a great way to like study for midterms and exams together. We got to do a bunch of cool like hangout sessions and stuff, the evenings and weekends and stuff like that. So I had an overall good experience. But I know a lot of, if you don't decide to live on res, and there are options to live outside of res, but in like the neighboring community outside. And I had a couple of friends that did that too, and they had a pretty good experience as well. They still were able to, because it's still close enough to sort of become friends with people living on res, but you save a little bit on the expenses in terms of how much it costs, because it's a little bit cheaper to rent something outside of the university. But both options are pretty good. I don't know if Taylor and Mitch what that was.
Yeah, so at Western I stayed at a res as well, which is actually a bit of a famous one. It's called Saugeen. So it's, I think, like the largest res there is in Southern Ontario. It's 2,000 students all in one building, something like that. I haven't been there in a long time, but so it's a pretty hectic place. There's a lot of people in a pretty small area. And then it's like the traditional style, so it was me on one side and my roommate on the other side. And then my roommate was 6'7", so whenever we were hanging out, it kind of looked like he was kidnapping me. But I like really, really enjoyed my time in res, and I thought I wouldn't have traded that experience for a lot of things. It's the best way to meet like as many different type of people as possible, right? Because whatever floor you're on, wherever you are, it's not just engineers or one kind of faculty. It's everybody who goes to that university just kind of sprayed together. So I really enjoyed it, and like Ridhdhi, a lot of my like really good friends and people I even lived with later came from that. So I really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, I was pretty much the same. I just had a really lucky shot that my best friend from like high school, we also ended up in the same res in the same room together, because you're able to apply to that and choose like to have certain people like in the same room as you. So that was pretty lucky. I don't think that happens very often, but that was not to say that we didn't. Like we met like a lot of people and got to meet some of our best friends now in first year as well. And so that's one of the cool things about living in res is you're kind of stuck with those people. So it's good and bad, because you're mixed with people who you could end up loving your roommate, you could end up like having debates with them, but like it is what it is, and that's just like kind of a growth experience. And you really get to learn how to live on your own, which is great. And you can also do that like if you don't live in residence, you can live off campus for your first year or whatever. But overall, really great experience. Definitely recommended. Wouldn't trade it for the world after all the experience that we got from it. It's really good. So it varies a lot, and I'm gonna say that for sure, don't really expect your co-op to necessarily be a reflection of what you would end up doing, because to an extent, sometimes you end up becoming a glorified admin because you're like the intern, and so people are like, hey, okay, get me a copy of this or whatever, right? Like they need to teach you stuff from the beginning, and they need to learn to trust you first. But just an example of some of the stuff I was doing, so I was helping actually, again, to an extent, a little bit more admin, but I actually did a lot of programming because I worked on designing a Microsoft Access database to kind of store all of our files, and it's really important when you're working on a project. So I was working on my department was working on a massive $150 million project that was essentially a new fueling and inspection and maintenance machine. So it was this massive machine that essentially has these different pieces, different tooling that they can switch between, and those they put into the actual fuel channels of the nuclear reactor to measure a whole bunch of things. Like over time, the fuel channels actually end up sagging in the middle because of all the uranium sitting in them, so they actually end up bowing, and then so they have to put a whole bunch of different inspection tooling in there. So we were designing that. But the one thing about Ontario Power Generation is, because it's a crown corporation, it works essentially with the government and stuff. It's essentially contracting most of the design work out to other agencies. So the actual design of that machine was done by a few separate agencies that we essentially oversaw their design. So every time they'd send us documents like, here's the design specs for this part of the machine, and then we would have to just go over them. And by we, I mean I barely went over any of them, but I kind of helped here and there, and I went to a lot of meetings and took meeting minutes. So from just like writing down what people were talking about, I kind of learned a bit. But again, for the most part, I was actually working on getting security clearance for people and getting them into the plant. So all the design people. The coolest part was that I actually got to, when one of the reactor units was down for scheduled maintenance, one of the guys one of the kind of retirees who came back and joined our team, he was like, hey, you want to go like 6 a.m. tomorrow, go inside the nuclear reactor and just walk around? And I was like, yeah, sure. Technically, it wasn't just to walk around. Like, they were doing stuff, but I was just there as like, this is a cool experience. So, I was wearing the big hazmat suit, walking around like Michelin Man, and I had the air hose connected to me, and it was really a really cool experience. And so those are some things that you can kind of get exposed to, and the radiation levels are like crazy high in there, so that's why you have to wear one of those suits. But it was so cool, and the cool thing is it's like this: if there was any time that there was like a major devastation to the world, I would probably, as long as it wasn't something that ended up like catastrophically exploding everything, I would go to a nuclear plant, because it has literally the highest security level of anything in the world. Like I'm pretty sure next to like, I don't know, like maybe like a rocket launch or something, it would be like one of the most like well secured places. Like, I've never seen armored vehicles and people walking around with machine guns like that in my life. So that was like super crazy because you have to do like 4 different levels of security just to get into the plant. So it's very interesting in that sense too. But yeah,